we decided to do Chapter 5, which is Ethics, Corporate Social Responsibility, and Sustainability. We were asked to find the latest annual country reports on human rights practices for the BRIC countries, which is Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and to create a table to compare the findings under the worker rights sections. We were asked to find the commonalities and differences. The second question under the research task was to compare the 5 industries thought to have the largest problems with bribery with those 5 that had the least problems. We were asked to find patterns between the two and what factors make some industries more conducive to bribery than others.
Here's what we found regarding each of the BRIC countries and their country reports on human rights practices. Starting off with Brazil, when we look at the freedom of expression, courts have blocked access to social media platforms, which is raising censorship concerns. Along with that, police violence has spiked with a sharp rise in killings by police, especially in Sao Paulo. Regarding political violence, there are 338 cases of threats and violence against political figures, and 33 killings have already been reported. Corruption is also high in Brazil. An example would be the allegations against former President Bolsonaro and others for falsifying records and the misuse of public funds. There are digital restrictions set. The Supreme Court suspended X, formerly known as Twitter, for refusing to block harmful accounts.
Now going to Russia. War crimes are very common. An example would be the continuous invasion of Ukraine, which is linked to extensive civilian abuses. Another example is the death of an opposing political leader, Alexei Navalny, in government custody. Hundreds of others have also been imprisoned for dissent, which is an example of political repression. Another example would be the freedom of expression that is not really in Russia due to harsh censorship laws that punish critics and journalists. Right now, there's about 783 documented political prisoners. And then finally, there is also religious persecution. For example, Jehovah's Witnesses and indigenous groups are targeted as extremists. And not to forget, the foreign agent laws are being used currently to silence NGOs, media, and civil society.
Next is India. There is civil society suppression happening, which is causing activists and journalists to face politically motivated charges. Tribal and minority communities, especially in Manipur, face systemic risks. This is an example of ethnic discrimination. The country's abilities to have freedom of assembly is also being diminished because there are reports of arbitrary arrests and restrictions on peaceful protests. Judicial backlog. An example of this would be NHRC handling over 5,500 cases in 2024 to 2025, with 904 still pending.
Now lastly is China. There are mass detentions. Uyghurs and Tibetans are subjected to arbitrary imprisonment and surveillance. Censorship over media, education, and online platforms are also tightly controlled. There is a transitional repression. The UN reports Chinese harassment and dissidents abroad. There is an extensive amount of religious control. Only 5 state-sanctioned religions are allowed. There is even suppression of some unauthorized practices. Digital surveillance is enforced. National digital ID systems have raised more privacy concerns.
Now for some commonalities. First, freedom of expression. All 4 countries face criticism for restricting media, online speech, or dissent. Next, we have civil society pressure. NGOs, activists, and journalists face legal or extrajudicial threats. Police or state violence. Reports of excessive force, arbitrary detention, or custodial deaths are very common. Judicial challenges, delays, politicization, or lack of independence in legal systems. And lastly, minority discrimination. Ethnic, religious, or indigenous groups face systematic bias or repression.
Now, differences. Brazil has high rates of police killings, political violence targeting elected officials. Russia has war-related abuses in Ukraine. Death of opposed leader Navalny is in custody. India has ethnic violence in Manipur, judicial backlog in human rights cases. And China has mass surveillance and detention of Uyghur transnational repression tactics.
And now on the topic of bribery, the 5 industries with the largest amount of bribery start with extractive at 19%, construction at 15%, transportation and storage at 15%, and information and communications at 10%, and utilities at 7%. The 5 industries with the least are education at 1%, health and social work at 2%, arts and entertainment at 2%, agriculture at 2%, and professional services at 3%.
Procurement complexity. Opaque bidding and subcontracting obscure accountability in large-scale endeavors. Standardized or public funding limits discretion in smaller. Urgency and bottlenecks. Time-sensitive operations, such as logistics, may grease wheels, while less urgency means fewer shortcuts sought. Oversight and transparency. Weak internal controls and limited audits enable corruption, while strong public or nonprofit oversight deters it. Cultural normalization. In some regions, bribery is seen as a business norm, while ethical norms and professional codes dominate in the business world. Market structure. Monopolies or limited competition foster corruption, while fragmented or decentralized markets dilute influence. And finally, cross-border exposure. Multinational face inconsistent enforcement abroad, while localized operations reduce jurisdiction risk.
Now some factors that make some industries more conducive to bribery. High value contracts, which are sectors like construction, extractives, and defense, involve massive deals making bribes more worth it. Frequent government interaction, which is industries needing permits, licenses, or regulatory approvals, face more bribery risks. Opaque procurement processes, which are complex bidding and subcontracting, obscure accountability, enabling kickbacks. And cross-border operations, which are multinational scope, increases exposure to weak governance and inconsistent enforcement. And lastly, limited oversight, which is in some regions enforcement is weak or captured by vested interests, allowing corruption to flourish.
Next, we will look at how this information can be used in businesses and why it is important to know. Number 1, risk assessment and market entry strategy. Understanding human rights conditions and bribery patterns helps businesses evaluate political and legal risk before entering and expanding in a country. It also adjusts investment strategies based on stability, rule of law, and reputational exposure. Along with that, it helps avoid high-risk sectors or regions where corruption or repression could jeopardize operations. For example, a tech firm considering expansion into Brazil must weigh digital rights restrictions and censorship risk before investing in social media platforms.
Number 2, compliance and anti-corruption safeguards. Bribery-prone industries such as construction or extractives require robust internal control, third-party audits, and FCPA/UK Bribery Act compliances. Companies must tailor due diligence to local realities, especially in countries with weak enforcement of politicized legal systems. For example, a mining company operating in Russia must implement strict anti-bribery protocols and monitor for human rights violations tied to land use or labor.
Number 4 is talent and partnership decisions. Human rights conditions affect employee safety, recruitment, and retention. NGOs, civil society, and media restrictions limit partnership opportunities and CSR initiatives. An example would be an NGO-backed health startup in India may face legal hurdles or reputational risk if it partners with politically targeted civil society groups.
Number 5 is strategic industry positioning. Knowing which industries are most and least prone to bribery helps firms prioritize sectors with lower compliance costs and reputational risk. It also informs sector-specific risk modeling for insurance, finance, and consulting firms. For example, a global bank may offer lower risk lending terms to agriculture or education ventures versus extractive or defense clients.
What was learned from a macro perspective? Number 1, authoritarian drift across BRIC nations. All 4 BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, exhibit shrinking civic space, with censorship, repression of dissent, and legal threats to journalists and activists. This signals a broader erosion of democratic norms, even in countries with electoral systems, affecting rule of law and investor confidence.
Number 2 is institutional fragility and political volatility. Judicial backlogs, politicized violence, and foreign agency law or agent laws show how weak institutions enable abuse and undermine accountability. Businesses must navigate legal unpredictability, especially in sectors tied to public contracts or regulatory approvals.
Number 3. Corruption is sector specific, not uniform. High bribery rates in extractive, construction, and transportation reflect structural vulnerabilities, large deals, and opaque procurement, and government dependence. Low bribery rates in education, health, and arts show that ethical norms and decentralized operations can insulate sectors from corruption. Number 4. Human rights and ESG are strategic, not just ethical. Mass surveillance, political killings, and war crimes aren't just moral concerns, they pose reputational, legal, and operational risk for global firms. ESG frameworks must integrate country-level human rights data to guide investment, compliance, and stakeholder engagement. And lastly, number 5, global businesses must be adaptive and context-aware. Companies need localized risk models that account for political repression, corruption exposure, and civic instability.